So welcome to Behind the Theme. Today we're talking about Hammer of the Scots by Columbia Games. So Behind the Theme is about taking the historical narrative or the theme of a game and really talking about the history or the theme of it and focusing on the less known facts. On top of that, in between we'll be talking about how the mechanics of the game brings out the feeling of that narrative, but mostly focusing on the history and the theme of the game, which is the kind of gamer I'm more tilted towards, which is thematic. So today with Hammer of the Scots, we'll be talking about the Scottish Wars of Independence. Now this will be a multi-part series, and the first few parts will be focusing on William Wallace because, to be honest, he is the more popular individual with movies like Braveheart and all of that. And on the second part, we'll be focusing on Robert the Bruce, which to me is the more substantial and important and interesting part of the Scottish Wars of Independence. So without further ado, let's start on the first part of William Wallace. Now the first thing you need to know about William Wallace is that the movie is by now very well known to be extremely historically inaccurate. It's like if someone took Warhammer Fantasy, the story of it, and said that it was the true story of Tolkien's Middle-earth. It is that inaccurate. You know, there are things that are similar, like in, let's say, Warhammer Fantasy and Middle-earth, you have dwarves and all that, but for the most part, if you put the history and the movie side by side, there is very little similarity. To prove that, one of the first things that's really interesting to note is the name of the movie, Braveheart. I'm sad to say that Braveheart is not even the nickname of William Wallace. Braveheart, and spoiler for the end of Robert the Bruce's history, I guess, he dies. But that was actually his nickname, and the reason why is because when Robert the Bruce died, he had his heart taken out, put in a casket, and carried to the Holy Land to fight on crusade against the enemies of God. So that's why he was called a brave heart. It was not actually associated with William Wallace. That is just a mix of the movie writer mixing in Robert the Bruce stuff and all the historical stuff. On note though, I would like to say that Braveheart is one of my favorite movies of all time. I just take it as an inspirational movie, but not as a historical one. And it brought back war movies in a large scale, so I thank you for that. Now that being said, the historical evidence for William Wallace itself is also not very strong. One of the reasons is because a lot of the historical documents from the 13th century about William Wallace were lost when all these documents, or what little they had on him, was put on a ship in the 17th century. And as it was sailing down to England, it actually sank. And so all these documents were lost and at the bottom of the sea, probably rotted and lost forever. And to let you know how bad the situation is with the history of William Wallace, we don't even know how he looks. From one source, alright, and even they extremely skeptical, they say that he had an arrow scar near his neck. He was 6'6", which is extremely tall. Edward Longshanks was 6'2", and most people at the time were about 5 feet tall, so 6'6" was amazing. And he was about 26 years old, and he probably spoke French because he was a descendant from Norman knights, and at the time the language of the knights and all that was French. But again, all of this is terribly shady, and thus we only have really one significant source of history for William Wallace. Now, so what is this one source that we have? The one source we have is actually the epic poem of William Wallace called, very inventively, The Wallace, by a poet named Blind Harry. Now, Blind Harry quotes his source as the writings of John Blair, who he said was Wallace's chaplain. Now, do note that Blind Harry was actually writing 150 years after Wallace's death. And to add less credibility to his sourcing, no one has ever found this John Blair or his writings, so there's nothing really to back it up. But still, that being said, fun note on the Wallace, it was in print and it was the second most popular book in Scotland, second only to the Bible at one point. The evidence that we do have, what we can say is probably, again, allegedly, William Wallace was born in Elderslie, which they promptly display in Elderslie. Now, Elderslie is in Glasgow, and another thing that's really disappointing if you really like the movie was that William Wallace was not even a Highlander. He was a lowlander. His family was a knightly family. Not a rich one, by the way, but they were landed, and their patron was actually the Stuart clan. Now, William Wallace was the second son of his father, and with the progenitor rule of succession, which is basically that the firstborn son gets all the lands and titles and everything of the father. This rule in society, sons like Wallace, the second son, had to find alternative ways of making a living, because it was never a good idea to depend on the leading son to give away some of his stuff to support the other sons. So for William Wallace, strangely, he was supposed to be a monk of the Colignac order. Now, that didn't really work out, and at some point, he ended up in Lanark and met Marion Braidfoot in a church. Now, of course, the story goes that they fell in love and then they got married. Now, before we go further into the history of that, there's a lot of speculation, and I believe personally well-founded speculation, that Marion Braidfoot never existed. And if you watch the movie, that person was called Moran. And again, another fun fact from the movie, the reason why he changed the name from Marion to Moran is because of the reasons I'm going to give now, and the reason why people speculate that Marion Braidfoot never existed. One of those is, it seems awfully coincidental that William Wallace, who is taken as the outlaw, like a Robin Hood, a hero of the people, who had his maid Marion, and Wallace, which is the Scottish version, suddenly has someone so coincidentally called Marion. Also, on top of that, the name Marion was suspiciously close to one of Blind Harry's neighbors, and the last one, and this one I couldn't find the source, but I heard it years ago and never forget it, so I might get details wrong. If someone can or knows anything about this, please do let me know. I remember a documentary saying that it could be a possibility that Blind Harry was paid to include a Marion Braidfoot because there was a family that wanted to be linked by lineage for honor and titles and everything to William Wallace. So as you can see, even the very historically inaccurate movie of Braveheart, the writer himself felt that putting a maid Marion in the story of Braveheart was a bit too cheesy in a way, and thus he changed the name to Moran. But that being said, continuing on with the sources that we have, it is said that the Sheriff of Lanark, Sir William Heselrigg, basically took a liking to Marion Braidfoot too. And so what he did was he tried to hit on her, so to speak, and everything. It didn't work out, and he murdered Marion Braidfoot. Now, there's also speculation among historians that say that at this point, it could also be that Wallace was already an outlaw, and so that this was one of the ways to lure him in. Now, after some time, Wallace did not appear, and everybody thought the matter was kind of settled, and no one expected that Wallace would return. But return he did, and he returned with a band, not only got into the castle of Lanark, killed the sheriff, Heselrigg, and burnt the castle, basically, and got away. And it's at this point that he starts his illustrious career, and also at this point where he enters history, basically around 1297. And they were successful with their rebellion in terms of the hit and run tactics and everything. And at one point they heard the English was coming up, and so they actually linked up with another very successful band of freedom fighters of Andrew Murray, and together this will lead to the situation of Stirling Bridge, of which we will get to next week. So in conclusion, like I said, that someone so important to Scottish history has only one great poem. I would like to learn about the real person. In fact, there's several more wilder speculations that he was an outlaw way before, and that he had even possibly raided Scottish people and all that. But thankfully, from here on out, we will get what is probably the more historically back stuff, because in the Battle of Stirling Bridge and in the subsequent episodes with Falkirk and Wallace's fall and so on, we have more archaeological evidence to back those things up, especially the battles. So thank you very much. Subscribe, comment, let me know about anything you want to see or hear, or anything that you want to tell me. So thank you very much. Till next word.